Okay, folks, welcome back, fam. This is your old pal Hondo again on another fishing video. This is just about fishing tips and what has worked for me over the years, what might work for you to catch some of these finicky little stocked trout in these lakes or creeks in different scenarios and different types of baits. We're going to go over what type of good line selection has worked for me over the years, lure presentation, rig presentations, and bait presentations. We're going to do an in-depth tutorial tip video on fishing for trout for beginners or panfish as well, because these type of tips also work for finicky, crappie, bass, and sometimes walleye as well. And the first thing we're going to go over is line presentation. There's 3 different types of lines here, X and minus fluorocarbon, that I like to use on the regular for trout fishing. First line I like to introduce to you, which is, I found it's not just for crappie, it works excellently on trout fishing. It comes in different colors like low vis yellow, comes in a clear and a green, and this beautiful line right here, which we all know trout are sight fish and they are very finicky about line selection. This is Camouflage Mr. Crappie Line Mega Spool. This is monofilament, has a low memory. It's a really good type of line. It's 6-pound test. Some of these big time fishermen will tell you 2 to 4 pound tests will only catch you these finicky trout, which is untrue. This camouflage line has different color tones to match the various depths of water conditions, and I find this stuff works really good for lure fishing as well on a main line situation. This is a great line in 6-pound test, because sometimes when I'm fishing for trout in lakes or in streams, sometimes I find myself catching a lot of smallmouth as well, and smallmouth and trout hit very differently than a bass. A bass will just slam it and run with it, which could break you off if you were a 4-pound test or 2-pound test. So I like a little bit more line, poundage test line, which is 6 is pretty good middle of the road line, because sometimes I catch a lot of smallmouth on inline spinners and small crankbaits and stuff like that for trout. So this is a really good line. Remember, camouflage line is also good for that as well. I've caught a lot of trout on this 10-pound test, which is a low visibility green. As you can see, it's a green color tone to this line, and it's 10-pound test, and some fishermen will tell you you can't catch trout on 10-pound test is BS. I like to use this when I'm float fishing or fishing on the bottom for with heavy rigs to catch fish on the bottom. When you're trying to haul them through a lot of structure and stuff using bait in lakes or rivers, you want a little bit more pound testage. Plus that, this stuff is low visibility, and it's good in all water conditions, and I found it working good in clear or dark water conditions as well. And line number 3 that I loved, I think this is probably one of the best line setups there is a braid. Usually if you're going to fish for trout, you want to use a 12-pound braid or a 10-pound braid with a fluorocarbon leader or a monofilament leader and a swivel, because this stuff here is extra sensitive, and you can feel the bait pulling. You feel the trout pulling on the line better than you can with the monofilament or the fluorocarbon. It's an extra sensitive line, and it's tough and durable. You can take a lot of abuse, but you want to use a lighter line. This is like 60-pound test. I'm just using this as a demonstration of the type of line I like. This is a good bait fishing line or a jig type of fishing line, but not so good for inline spinners, because if you use this for inline spinners, you're going to have to put a swivel and a piece of monofilament as a leader to run this if you're going to do that. Unlike monofilament or fluorocarbon, you don't need to do that. You can just run it, the lures on the main line as itself. This is a sinking line. A lot of folks don't know that monofilament is a floating line. It's good for topwater baits. It's also good for deep fishing, as well, but it performs a lot better with inline spinners or, both baits that don't need to sink to the bottom, like this line's good for. This is the best line I also recommend you a line if you're going to use like Snell rigs or Carolina rigs for bait fishing or jig fishing. I would go to this line right here, which is braided. Folks, the next thing and we're going to cover is baits. Different types of baits for different types of fish. First thing we got is corn. There's various other types of synthetic baits you can get for different types of water conditions, or there's different types of baits that float or they sink. Worms and corn and, you know, chicken McNuggets, fries, marshmallows are a good bait. Pieces of cheddar cheese is a good bait. Use hot dogs to catch these finicky trout. But if you're going to do that, you're going to need some kind of float rig system because it sinks to the bottom, where these type of power baits will float, so you don't need some kind of floating device on your rigs to use this bait. The way you rig this bait up, the power baits in particular, you also got to know, for a note too, is if the water's murky, this type of green bait or the regular power bait is not a good color tone for murky water, so you might want to use some kind of like red type of power bait in murky water conditions, like a salmon egg or something that is dark colored, you know, like a red or a orange or some kind of color tone that is bright red or something like that in murky water conditions. But in, you know, semi-murky, clear water conditions, you can get away with using green, yellow, or whatever color, purple, whatever type of color bait in clear water conditions. This bait, this float setup here, this is a float bait, and they do come in different types, like salmon egg, gulp make a bait as well with this as well. That is a floating bait. You just have to know which ones are floating baits, but with the sinking bait, you can pretty much put that on any kind of setup that you want. But, you know, different types of baits work. I've caught trout on chicken McNuggets, fries. I've caught them on hamburger. I've caught them on hot dogs. I've caught them on cheddar cheese. I've caught them on just about any type of bait you can imagine. But, you know, if you're using this power bait setup, you don't need a piece of cork or something on your main line to float the bait up. This stuff floats. But if you're using a regular type of bait, you'll have to use a floating type of rig setup, and that's pretty much it. You know, most of the synthetic baits or just natural baits that you can find in your cupboard, or, you know, bread even works. You could dip bread in cheese whiz and dip it in some garlic and chuck it out there on a float rig setup, and that'll catch a trout as well. That's been the bait selection that I've used, and it works good for me. Next, folks, we're doing the basic rig setups here. We have two different rig setups here. We got one right here. This is the common and most popular rig setup. This is called a Snell rig. What they mean by Snell rig is the way the knot is tied to the hook. This is a size 10 bait hook from Eagle Claw. It has a little bend in it, so whenever you set the hook, it turns in the fish's mouth. And it has these little barbs on the back right here that hold the bait on there. This type of Snell rig system is good for the weight is good for any type of baits you want, like worms. You could use power bait with this system. I see a lot of people using them just to tie the main line to the loop, barrel loop here. They always come in a barrel loop in a blister pack of like 10 Snell rig setups. Some people like tying a main line on there and running about, you know, 2 foot with a split shot on the main line right there. Or the common way that you should be using this is like a drop setup, like a weight on the bottom and a main line tied right here in a barrel knot like that, and it ties off like that and it dangles from the top like that, like a drop shot rig setup, and the bait will dangle and suspend over there, so that way if you're not using a floating bait, it just suspends like that and the fish will see it. I find this rig setup, if you're trying to use it with just the main line tied right here on the back and using a split shot and throwing it out there for trout, sometimes the trout are really finicky. They'll grab a hold of the bait and they feel that drop shot weight dragging along the back end of it, and they'll drop the bait. And I lose a lot more fish that way with the Snell rig setup than I do with the drop shot when it's drop shot rigged. And that's one of the most popular rigs for catching trout. Now the next rig we're going to go over is a what I call a Carolina rig, bait rig setup. As you can see right here, I got a 3-foot main line leader tied with a piece of 10-pound test, 3 foot long, with a barrel swivel on it. The swivel also helps keep the line from getting twisted into the reel and causing backlash in your reel. Also too, I put a hook, like a size 8 hook, long shank hook, with a floating device right here on the end of it. What that does is when you're fishing this bait with non-floating bait, it'll float the bait up above the leader, and the egg weight, use a sliding egg weight on your main line. Any type will do. A bullet weight will work, an egg weight will work. What it does is it floats and suspends the bait up above the fish, the line of sight where the fish can see it pointed up like this, because if it's just laying on the ground like this with no floating on it, it's going to drag the bottom and the fish is not going to see the bait. So this helps suspend the bait upwards in the line of sight of the fish. Now, trout are notorious for hiding in rocks or behind tree limbs and ambush bait that comes up in their line of sight, which is above. So they grab it, and I've caught tons of trout this way and lost less rigs in river scenarios. This is also good for rivers, pond fishing, lake fishing. Works really good in both scenarios. The snell rig is not so good for river fishing because it always constantly gets snagged, and you lose a lot more rigs that way because it has no floating device on it if you're using non-floating baits. But if you're using like power bait, floating type of baits, it works great for that because you don't need a float for it. So those are the two best common bait rigs I like to use for catching these trout. Also, you can use this Carolina rig without the floats with the power bait setup and smush it on there, and it'll float and suspend the bait up, and you'll catch more trout that way. The next thing we're going to go over is lures. Now, there's different types of lures. You can use plastic baits. We have inline spinners, which are they got different types of inline spinners and spoons. This is just the one I have as an example. This is a inline spinner, and we have small tiny crankbaits. Some are better than others, you know, in different makes. Rapala make one, Rebel make one. You know, different companies make these little tiny crankbaits, which will catch you trout in the early fall. They won't catch you trout too much in spring, but they will catch you a lot of smallmouth and a lot of trout in late fall, like early September, October, November, and marabou jigs. Believe it or not, these little marabou jigs for crappie fishing will catch you trout as well. Sometimes you can put like a little piece of worm on the end of them and jig them in a river or a lake, and them trout will go nuts for these, and so will certain types of pan fishing. Also, we have the jig option, which is a lot of people don't know. You could use synthetic plastic baits as well with a jig head or a float in rivers or lakes. The one that I like the most, and I think really will catch you a lot of trout, is the Gulp Live minnows. These things will catch you tons of trout. The way you want to rig these up is either with a jig head and a bobber float in a lake will catch you trout. In a river system, you just want to use a plain jig head and find a deep pool to drop these in, and you will catch tons and tons of trout on these if nothing else works. Also, color selection with these different types of lures also are a big factor on if you're going to catch them or not. Like with these type of inline spinners, if the water conditions are clear water, you can get away with using silver spinners and a dark body. And in darker water conditions, you may want to use a copper spoon and maybe a gold, like a dark body, brown feather tip. The way you want to use these type of lures, this is a very vibration type of lure. When you run it through the water, you want to run it with you want to cast in one area, cast another area, cast another area. If you don't catch a fish, you move on to another area. This is a type of lure that you have to really move around a lot to catch a fish. You can't really use it in the same area once. So move around. It gives you a lot of options to move around to catch more fish. Like I said, clear water, silver spinner, black body, darker water, gold spinner, you know, white feather, something like that, white and gold. I mean, in dark water conditions, but in clear water conditions, you can get away with a darker color and a silver spinner. Like I said, the little crankbaits are good. Different types of crankbaits you got jerk baits, crankbaits, but they also come in little micro baits. These are good in fall. Different colors. You might want to change up different colors. You want to see what kind of minnows. You might want to use a real minnow color instead of this like perch, yellow perch type of color in these creeks, because most of these creeks and rivers don't have perch. This might work better in a lake than a type of river or something. Now with these little marabou jigs, also water condition, like if the water's clear, this chartreuse and black is great for that. If the water is dark, you might want to use a red and white type of feather, or you could use this black type of feather, black body, in dark water conditions as well. It's just about water conditions to catch those trout. Also with these type of plastic baits too, you might want to find something that matches the minnow situation in these creeks. Most of the creeks have chubs and silver shiners and shad and stuff like that, so you're gonna have to match what they're hitting. Another tip for the inline spinner though is if you want to, you know, save time and having to keep tying these on and over and over and over again, you could use a swivel hook keeper like this on the main line. That way, if you're wanting to swap out baits fast, you could just, you know, put one of these inline spinners on real fast, clip it on, take it off, put it back on, and this also keeps the main line from getting tore up by fish, and you don't have to tie it on as much for these inline spinners. This is also a good way for that. MIPS make a good inline spinner. Blue Fox makes a good inline spinner. Panther Martin make a good inline spinner. So does South Bend. But this one here is actually the Ozark Trail spinner. This is the one I caught a 4-pound trout on, and I was decimating the trout on this one. And I used the MIPS and the Rooster Tail, and I used the Panther Martins, and I caught more fish on this cheap Ozark Trail spinner, inline spinner. Okay, last but not least is the rod selection types that you want to use for trout fishing. Here I have two of my favorite examples of fishing rod setups I use for trout fishing. We have the Lonely Spin Cast. This is the Zebco Micro 33. And this here is the RB Garcia 101 spinning reel. These are the two common reels that people will use in a fishing scenario, but I used one for lures, which is the inline spinner for my jig fishing and my inline spinner fishing. This one here has a 5'6" rod. You can get away with using a 5'6" rod in small creeks, and sometimes in lakes I would use a 7-foot or a 6'6" rod, or a 6-foot rod if you're going to run in a pond or a lake for fishing for trout. But for a small creek, this rod size is good. It's a medium action rod with a small Zebco type of reel. They also come in 11s, but this one here is the 1 ball bearing, 2 ceramic pickup pin drag bait alert system, which is plenty for creek fishing. And the reason why I like this fishing reel setup over the spinning rod setup for casting lures is there is very or little or less line twist and backlash on these newer reels. Unlike the spinning rod, I get a lot more backlashes and have to constantly take rat's nest out of the reel. This is a great reel setup for your inline spinners, your jigging, and your crankbait setup, tiny micro crankbait setups. Rod number 2, right here is what I use is the for bait fishing sometimes, and sometimes I like using it for lure fishing too. I do got this on. This is just an example. This is a Zebco hot cast rod, spinning rod, and the spinning reel. This is a great fishing type of setup for bait fishing, for your Carolina rig, your Snell rig type of setups. 6-pound test on both of them. I do get a lot more line twists in these type of reels than I do the spin cast reels. But these are great for all around bait fishing if you're just going to use one rod for bait fishing. But for this kind of setup, you want a good 6'6" rod with a really soft tip on both of them. You don't really want a hard tip. You want a medium light fishing rod for this setup. For bait fishing, you want a 6'6" setup. This is also good for float fishing for trout. We'll get into the floats later on in another video, but I really don't like using float rig setups for fishing for trout. But the rod has enough length on it to where you can set the hook and drive the hook in deep with a 6-foot rod and a soft tip. The light line is also good. You can feel the fish hitting a lot better for bait fishing and stuff like that. It's good for sight fishing. Like I said, this is my go-to fishing rod for catching trout or panfish or bass on a light rig setup, and it just does great for bait. Now, the other one I use for the crankbaits and the inline spinners, because you really don't need a huge rod for that. And pretty much that's what you want to use for a trout rod setup. You don't really have to use anything special or spectacular. But if you're using bait, you want to use a 7-foot to 6-foot, 6-foot type of rod, medium light action type of rod for your bait. You want to use a medium light rod, about 5'6" for your crankbaits and your inline spinners and that type of thing. For that setup, that's what I like to use. That's just my own opinion on this, and that's been the rod selection. If you like these beginner tips for trout fishing, please smash the like, share, and subscribe on this video. If you have liked this video, please share it. Leave a comment and tell me what you think of this video on some beginner tips on trout fishing. If you don't know anything about trout fishing, if you know a lot about trout fishing, this video is not for you. But if you're just a beginner in trout fishing and you need a few little tips that might help you out to catch some of these finicky stock trout or wild brown trout or brook trout, this video helps you. Please leave me a like and subscribe and tell me what you think of this video. This has been your old pal Hondo from Hillbilly Tactical Outdoors. Y'all take it easy. You put God first. He puts you first every time. You know else, YouTube. God loves you. So does your old boy Hondo. Peace.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face. Tell me that you love me, even if it's fake.